Oh, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this continuing conversation with Evan Vorpahl about what's happening with the Wisconsin Supreme Court. We have other videos where we've talked about Elon Musk and Dick Uihlein, and we've got a couple other right-wing groups we want to talk about. And so let me just turn over to you. Evan, tell us about the next group that you've been looking into.
Sure. One of the groups spending in this race is the Republican State Leadership Committee, RSLC, which is spending $2 million already in this race through its judicial spending arm, Judicial Fairness Initiative. And this group has really been, in some ways, an extension of Leonard Leo's court capture operation on the state level. We released a report last year detailing how Leo has been targeting these state Supreme Court races for over 20 years through the Federalist Society and through some of his other dark money groups, such as the Judicial Crisis Network, which is now called the Concord Fund. In 2007, actually, the Federalist Society hired Kellyanne Conway's polling company and launched a media campaign in Wisconsin. In years following that, Leo's Judicial Crisis Network funded groups like Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce and Wisconsin Alliance for Reform in Wisconsin's judicial races. But really, Leo started investing heavily through RSLC in 2014. One of the ways this group has spent in prior Wisconsin Supreme Court races, and since 2020, this group, Leo's Concord Fund, has given it over $7 million.
Wow.
An investigation in 2022 found that Leo was targeting judicial seats in 42 states, and that number has probably grown since.
But of course, we also know now that Leonard Leo got his sort of start in Supreme Court issues, aiding the confirmation of Clarence Thomas, in spite of the very serious and compelling testimony of Anita Hill about the ways in which Clarence Thomas had grotesquely sexually harassed her, which Thomas denied. But none of that was an obstacle to the support of Leonard Leo. In fact, to this day, they, remain very close, and Leo has promoted Thomas in numerous ways. And so when you put that in context, like here we are in the state of Wisconsin, and now we have RSLC, the Republican State Leadership Committee, which has been substantially funded by Leo's groups or Leo-tied groups now for years. And again, it's weighing in on a Wisconsin Supreme Court race like it does, it has several cycles in a row. And this time it's doing so in a way to back Brad Schimel, who is working with the Republican Party of Wisconsin to try to flip the control of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Can you tell me a little bit more about JFI? I sort of refuse to call it Judicial Fairness Initiative, having seen so many of their ads. I remember, for example, a few years ago, they were sending out, RSLC was helping to send out messaging around, so these right-wing judges as so-called rule of law judges. And yet, we know that rule of law means something totally different to them than to ordinary people in terms of actually following legal precedents like precedents that protect women's reproductive rights. So can you tell us a little bit more about JFI and what it's doing now and sort of what its history, a little bit of its history here in Wisconsin and other states?
Yeah, and I just wanted to put a finer point to that. They claim they're backing rule of law judges, but it's really just about power politics and just a way for Leo to impose his vision on our democracy. And that was on display in 2010 when he secretly raised six-figure sums to help keep Prosser on the court, specifically to protect Scott Walker's agenda. And so Republican State Leadership Committee, it's an IRS 527. It can receive unlimited funds from corporations, wealthy individuals, and then from RSLC, it funds RSLC JFI. JFI's only funder is RSLC. So we don't know for certain who is underwriting these ads, but we think that Concord Fund is certainly playing a role here. Oftentimes the Concord Fund will fund RSLC, and then RSLC will send a very close amount of money to JFI, which will then run these ads. Other funders include right-wing billionaires like Miriam Adelson. Koch Industries is a funder, Big Tobacco, Big Oil. So it's all these corporate actors investing in RSLC, which is then pumping this money into state judicial elections. The group has been active in all sorts of states. In 2024, they're very active in Ohio and Montana, other state court races where they're trying to put a partisan majority on the court instead of independent judges. Another thing about
go on.
on
Go on.
RSLC too. In 2010, RSLC's Red Map project was responsible for a devastating gerrymander in Wisconsin, and the president of Red Map at the time is actually a close Leo associate. For years, he was a very close advisor to Leo's JCN, otherwise known as the Concord Fund, and he's also the settler of Leo's Marble Freedom Trust, the $1.6 billion trust that that was gifted to him from Barry's side.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you mentioned what you mentioned about RSLC and its pattern, because as you and I traced out a few years ago, it might have been I don't know what year it was, might have been 2019 or 2020, but RSLC was basically receiving money from a group tied to Leonard Leo. About within a week, that money would then a similar amount would go into RSLC JFI, and then the money would sort of be used to buy ads. But the ads wouldn't run until the week before the election. And so in the broader public, you don't really see that happening. What happens is all of a sudden, a week before the election happens, the general election, $1 million gets spent in 1 week, which you and I called the $1 million cash bomb, because basically at that time, and now Wisconsin's Supreme Court race is costing even so much more, but at the time, just a few years ago, that $1 million spending in 1 week was more than what the candidate themselves, the judicial candidate themselves, raise and spend in their entire campaign over the course of a year. And so that $1 million is basically spent almost entirely on attack ads, attacking the candidate that they do not want to be on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And in one of those cases, and please describe this a little bit more, but in one of those cases, that they move the polling by 5 points in that 1 week period with that $1 million ad buy. Is that right? Or more than 5 points, possibly. Yeah.
RSLC bragged in detail, especially about the 2019 Wisconsin Supreme Court race and how they delivered a victory for Brian Hagedorn, who now sits on the court. And they basically described how in the last week of that race, they moved the margin heavily in his favor, coming from behind, targeting specifically their Republican base and basically base voters to get them to turn out in these off-year elections. And another thing that sort of adds a level of opaqueness to RSLC is the fact that a lot of these Wisconsin Supreme Court races, they're happening in off years, odd years, and due to reporting schedules, we actually have no idea who's giving money to RSLC this year. We won't get those filings until July, and by then the race will be over for months. So we just have no idea who's actually funding the group right now, other than what we've seen in the past.
Wow. Well, can you tell us a little bit more about one of the other big groups spending in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race? That's the Americans for Prosperity arm. I just have to begin this question with a bit of a statement, which is, one of the worst decisions ever issued by the U.S. Supreme Court by John Roberts' court is the Citizens United decision, which I think really should be called Billionaires United, because it unleashed these billionaires to play this extraordinary distorting role in our elections. And one of the things about that decision, which struck down the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act at the federal level, and it had implications at the state level as well. But one of the things about that decision is that Justice Kennedy, who John Roberts asked to write that opinion, asserted that without coordination, this money would have almost no value. All this money would have no value to the candidates, when obviously that wasn't true at the time at all. It was just a myth that he put into that decision. But also, it's certainly not been true over the past 15 years, where we've seen this money in some cases be decisive, and now increasingly coordinated in some ways, like we've seen happening in a number of states where what used to be some understandings about coordination are not allowed. Now, the issue is a little complicated because state law is different than federal law. State Wisconsin law is different than the federal law regarding federal elections. But what you have here in Wisconsin with Americans for Prosperity is its advertising campaigns are powerful. They are valuable to the candidate, even if the candidate isn't controlling them or coordinating them. I actually have these huge postcards that I get, from the Koch operation. This one, this one attacking Susan Crawford, promoting Brad Schimmel. They use like just a terrible photo of her, and then they make him look like they call him the fair judge. These postcards are going to registered Democrats and independents and Republicans. So they're targeting on a nonpartisan or transpartisan basis voters with their disinformation. And we know for a fact that some of those ads that Charles Koch has helped underwrite through Americans for Prosperity, including these postcard campaigns, that they again reiterate this lie about them being rule of law judges or fair judges or what have you. Like, this is not just with Schimmel, and it's not specific to Schimmel, but in general, that's the rhetoric that Charles Koch uses. That's the rhetoric he used around backing Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, was that these would be rule of law judges. Meanwhile, they've been working to celebrate the destruction of the rule of law, the destruction of legal precedents, including Chevron. That was a bit of a long opening, so I'm sorry to say, just to kind of set the stage for this ongoing presence of Charles Koch's field operation in Wisconsin. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's been happening this time in this cycle with Americans for Prosperity, which I, by the way, call Americans for Greed?
Sure, yeah, and they're spending over $2 million this race. They were one of the earliest backers of Brad Schimmel. They endorsed him in November. And I just want to say, too, that Koch has been heavily invested in Leo's court packing operation that we talked about earlier. He's a huge funder of the Federalist Society, and he's deployed Americans for Prosperity in many of the same states where we saw the Federalist Society, where we saw JCN, where we saw RSLC, all spending money to basically undermine fair justice, to put judges on the bench that they support and attack other judges that would support the actual rule of law. In some of these states, they've attacked merit selection committees, and they've basically attacked judicial nominating commissions, which would play a role in reducing this partisanship that we're seeing in a lot of these elections. So Koch has been right there with Leo on a lot of this and actually funding Leo's operations. And like you said, the rule of law, this is a rhetoric that they often use, and they've used it for Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett recently, and they're running all these mailers for Schimmel now. But in reality, like, they back judges for their point of view and knowing that they're going to rule a certain way. AFP supported the gerrymandering in Wisconsin, and despite sort of the PR claims that Koch doesn't necessarily like Trump, his political operation has supported many of the officials in lockstep with Trump's administration and agenda, and is continuing to do lobbying and media blitzes on behalf of Trump's tax cuts for the rich. In 2024, this is a massive operation. The affiliated super PAC, AFP Action, spent $157 million backing Republican candidates for the U.S. House and Senate. House Speaker Mike Johnson even joked at a recent event that he has AFP tattooed on his back. So
wow,
this is Koch's agenda.
Wow, I had not heard that, Evan. Thank you so much for capturing that quote. It really is. It's just astonishing. We've got a few minutes left. I know this is part 3 of our series on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. We may have some other series coming up about some of the other groups, some of the anti-abortion rights groups, some of the other groups that are weighing in on the Wisconsin Supreme Court races. But can you tell us a little bit more before we wrap about the business operation in the state, the Wisconsin Manufacturing and Commerce, which is the arm or the state affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? Can you tell us a little bit about their activities?
Sure. In Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, WMC, they've been one of the heaviest spenders on state court elections, and they've just played a large role in general in influencing the court and steering it in a more right-wing, pro-corporate direction. This cycle already, they're spending $2.9 million in the race, which is on par for a lot of their other races, and that's surely going to be a number that increases. In 2023, they were the heaviest spender behind Dan Kelly at more than $5.5 million. And this is a group that's been heavily funded by some of Leo's groups. Earlier in the decade, they were funded by a group called the Wellspring Committee, which is tied to Leonard Leo, and then running ads in these judicial elections. And in more recent years, they've been funded by Leo's Concord Fund and Judicial Crisis Network. So it just seems to be another face to this multi-pronged assault on our judiciary by these right-wing groups.
Wow. Evan, it's such a joy to work with you. And it's also just so nice to have you on the Midas Touch Network, on Legal AF, to talk about your fantastic research and all of your sleuthing into sort of the right-wing infrastructure and their efforts to capture the courts at the federal level as well as in the states. I so appreciate your coming on. Please join us in subscribing to Midas Touch Network, to Legal AF. Subscribe to this channel, like and share, and please come back. We'll have more information for you about what's happening in Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Supreme Court and other court issues and other legal issues nationwide. So thank you so much, Evan, for coming on, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, Lisa.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.